Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, the instructor for INR 2002. And today, with this video lecture, I would highlight the main point of Chapter 4, which is focusing on world politics from a historical perspective, all the way from basically the beginning of the 20th century to what to after the effects of World War II. The major way I can summarize the chapter for you is by suggesting that it has 5 major aspects. Okay, I organized these things, as you know, on the PowerPoints that I provided you. It's all linked inside our module. It go into details. I've also provided, as you know, chapter summaries and outlines, and learning objectives and everything. So the way I can summarize the chapter for you is this. You need to learn, the chapter is talking about the UN and the collective security. Then it's focusing on the Cold War and the nuclear weapons. Another topic is decolonization and the global south. Next one is superpowers and proxy wars. And last but not least is European integration after what? The fall of, Berlin Wall. So having said that one, what are the learning objectives? Well, the learning objective would be at least 4 major factors. Learning about UN and how is that related to collective security, Cold War and how is that related to the nuclear weapons and their impact, superpowers, proxy wars during the Cold War period, and last but certainly not least about European integration following the end of the Cold War. Now, having said this, let me start by very first topic. The very first topic, as you probably noticed, it talks about the UN and the collective security. Oh, the first thing I should mention is what is a collective security? And here, collective security is an arrangement among a bunch of states, and the whole notion of that is that the entire international community is a member of this organization. So therefore, all are united against any one aggressor. And where is this aggressor coming from? Among themselves. So if, for example, country A is attacking country B, all other countries from C to Z, they get together, they help the victim against the aggressor. That makes sense? Okay, so this is the logic of collective security, and I want to make sure that you understand the difference between collective security and collective defense. I think that's one of the weak side of the chapter. So these are some of the things that I like to make sure that you understand, because sometimes people, they confuse collective security with collective defense. They're 2 different things. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is a collective defense, which basically means an association, a military pact between a bunch of states that they have common interest and similarities of their system and same logic and same defense system and everything against an outside enemy. So NATO was organized, is that right? Against, during the Cold War, right? After the Cold War started, against Soviet Union. Okay, the notion was not that, Soviet Union was a member of the NATO and then let's do some collective security. No, 2 completely different things. So NATO is a collective defense, and that's one of the parts that I don't think your book's author were very, very clear about it. So I want to make sure that my students are clear about this notion. And the best example of collective security is United Nations. Why? Because United Nations had all the states as its members. Is that right? For all practical purposes. Now, from time to time, you see some states leaving, coming back, whatever. Is that right? But the whole notion is at least it has more members than any other organization. And then among these states, if there is an aggressor, everybody else would unite to to protect basically the victim. Okay, and in the history of the United Nations, this has happened really technically twice, because all the other time during the Cold War period, it was basically anytime issue came up to Security Council, which was in charge of the war and peace issues. One of the permanent members, which you remember, the permanent members of the UN were what? U.S., USSR during the Cold War, UK, France, and what? China. Okay, first it was the nationalist leaders, and then in 78 and everything, after 19 basically 71, 72, when Nixon administration went and they basically reopened relationship with China. Then little by little, nationalists were forced out, and then what, the PRC, People's Republic of China, or mainland China, took that one seat. Okay, having said that, so we have an understanding of this one. The question would be, why did they come up with the UN? Well, because League of Nations, as we mentioned before, it failed in its job. What was its job? To prevent World War II. And the World War II happened in 1939. Is that right? So when it failed in that regard, it failed in two things. First of all, to understand dealing with the notion of sovereignty, sovereign states. Is that right? Second of all, to do something about creating a workable international security. So those are the two factors that your chapter is really focusing on. I want to also mention that when the UN was established, they tried to make sure that the Charter of the UN is more sophisticated and more comprehensive, and it gets rid of some of the failures that the League of Nations had from its basically charting document. All right. Having said that, remember something about UN. When I teach about international organization, I always tell my students that remember the three major goals of the UN are what we call the three Ps. I call them the three Ps. First of one is peace, comes with security, peace and security. Second one, borrowing the words of Thomas Jefferson, prosperity. This is what our founding fathers used to called prosperity, which nowadays nobody says prosperity, they say economic development. Is that right? And the third one is promotion of human rights. So when I tell my students, remember the three major goals of the UN, the three Ps: peace, prosperity, and promotion of human rights. Well, just remember, prosperity should just remind you about what? Economic development. So you say peace and security, prosperity and economic development, and promotion of human rights. So those would be the three Ps as far as the goals of the UN is concerned. Okay, and then so we mentioned that obviously the peace and security was dealt with in the Security Council. So what about the other goal of the UN, which is what? Development or economic development. Well, that was an issue very, very important for the new members of the UN, because many of them were what? African, Asian countries that we called developing countries, and they were not, their society was just received their independence, or they were behind the developed countries of Western Europe, North America, and then Far East, and they needed support economically, materially, etc., to catch up. Okay, so this has become one of the major goals of the UN, and is listed under the UN and the global development notion. The other notion that I want you to remember from the chapter is the idea of the Cold War and the nuclear weapons. Well, as you know, it was two nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that basically ended World War II. Is that right? Defeat of, Japan was the very last thing that happened, unconditionally, etc. And then by the end of the war, first the US had it, by 1945, and then soon after that, a few years later, Soviet Union had it. And then now you can see other members of the, significant member of international community, like the UK, France, and then what? And of course, guess what? China had it. So here we go. And these are interesting enough, a permanent member of the, Security Council. So they had it. And at least when we focus on the two big ones, the two superpowers, there was a situation between the two that they were holding each other's population like hostage, and the very fact that they had so many weapons and everything, it forced them to think twice not to take a chance and directly challenge the other side militarily. Okay, so this was the byproduct of a concept called mutual assured destruction, or MAD, or MAD for short. And the good thing about MAD, was at least people, they thought twice about it, not to take chances. Is that right? Because any kind of military exchanges between US and USSR would have led into World War III. One of the other factors that your chapter is talking about is United Nations and the non-state actors. United Nations has some specialized organizations like, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, like IMF, International Monetary Fund, like IBRD, World Bank, is that right? Like WHO, World Health Organization. These are not states, these are actually specialized agencies, but they also get involved in world politics. Is that right? One of the other things I wanted to mention at this level, the chapter doesn't mention as much about it, is there are also some other entities that would be considered non-state actors. Like what? Like any basically liberation movement that is short of the orthodox definition we have for a concept of state. Remember, state is a legal, political, or and political, unit or apparatus that has 5 major characteristics of people, territory, government, sovereignty or independence, and diplomatic recognition. Well, if its organization is missing something, is that right? Or a group of people, then it's not a state, so it's a non-state actor. So, for example, PLO, People's, Palestinian Liberation Organization, is a good example of that. And actually, that has supposedly, transferred into the Palestinian Authority, which is even getting closer to become, a state, but it's not a completely state because it doesn't, again, have all those 5 factors in terms of diplomatic recognition, complete sovereignty. It doesn't have complete sovereignty because within its territory, there are still other elements running the show. Is that right? As far as they're concerned, are occupied by another local power. So, having said that one, I want to make sure that point is very clear. But it's also very important to know that, United Nations is trying to because they're not always successful, to carry on a type of international relation which is based on law or based on international law. And it respects human rights, it respects social justice, and it cares about environment. So having said that, now let's get to talk a little bit about Cold War and nuclear weapons. Well, again, collective security was supposed to bring a sense of peace. Is that right? And the nuclear weapons, by their sheer number and the amount of them between the 2 major superpowers, is that right? Well, of course, they were making people feel on the edge, because how about if an accident happens, or if one uses, the other one has to use it. And there was a time that the 2 powers, they have so many nuclear weapons that they could destroy our planet 13 times over. I mean, if you destroy it once, why should you destroy it 12 more times? Is that right? But, the good thing about it was, well, thank goodness, it didn't happen. Otherwise, none of us would be here right now. Is that right? And so that period, thank goodness, finished with the demise of the Soviet Union. All right. Something else that your chapter is focusing on is interpreting the Cold War. And here, there are at least 3 different interpretations. I'm not going to go to the details because I want you to read the chapter and read my summaries and look at the PowerPoint and everything. 1 could be focusing on the political dimension. 2 could be focusing on the conflict's functionality. 3 could be focusing on the ideological dimension. And these are the things that you need to really consider when you look at the interpretation. Another topic is muddying the water, nuclear weapons. Well, as I mentioned, nuclear weapons entered the international relation with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But those events, even though it brought peace between at least Japan and the Allies and everything, the hard part of it was how many innocent people suffered. Is that right? Yes, some military installation were destroyed, but so many more civilians were killed, and destruction of the cities and everything, that it really shook the world. And people, they thought this should not be happening again. So a very distinguished American military strategist, Bernard Brodie, suggested this is something that should never happen again. So the issue is not winning the war anymore. The issue should be avoiding such a thing. And again, comes with that one, the whole emphasis on mutual, assured destruction. Is that right? MAD, M-A-D. And that, in a way, brought some kind of peace because of the massive amount of weapons in the hand of those 2 superpowers. Now, enough about this one. Let's look at the other process which started, the cold decolonization, especially after World War II. Because what World War II did was basically destroyed what? It basically destroyed the military power of a lot of the colonial powers that traditionally have been in Europe. Is that right? So they couldn't basically stand up, and a lot of their colonies, empowered by their weakness from one side, and another side empowered by the notion of nationalism, which started in Europe and it got through European operation in these global South countries, it got there. Is that right? We're nationalistic, that they want us to stand up to foreign invasion and foreign forces. So they became independent and they became a part of what it became known as the Third World. Third World is a concept that basically was championed by Alfred, Souay, basically a French economist and, demographer. He, I think, published an article in 1952 and he used the term Third World. Basically refers to a group of countries that are not a part of the First and the Second World. And you would say, okay, what's the First and Second World? Well, the First World were supposed to be the capitalistic Western democracies led by U.S. The Second World supposed to be the socialistic, and communist, regime led by Soviet Union. So what is left? A bunch of developing countries that they wanted to be neutral. They didn't want to be a part of the First World or the Second World. So they became what? The Third World. Now, we also mentioned that, and these third world countries, by the way, are what nowadays, we don't call them third world anymore, we call them global south. Is that right? Third world belong to a Cold War period. Why? Because there was a first and second war. Now we don't have those. So I mentioned, if you recall, I mentioned that superpowers were smart enough, at least not to directly, challenge each other militarily. Of course, they challenge each other ideologically, they challenge each other economically, they challenge each other, politically. But thank goodness they didn't challenge each other directly militarily. So what happened? Did they still fought with one another? Yes, they fought indirectly. And those indirect war, conflicts is what we call superpowers proxy war, which is one of the other topics that your chapter is talking about. So we see throughout the Cold War, either a U.S. ally is somehow invaded by an ally of the Soviet Union, or maybe two countries are fighting one another, and then Soviet Union goes and support one of them, we go support the opposite side. You see, there were so many different versions of it. But basically what happens is each one of the superpowers, they start what? Supporting their own allies militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, everywhere to what? To win that conflict. And in that regard, they're not fighting each other directly, but they're fighting each other indirectly. So two major examples of this are perhaps the Angolan Civil War, which was between 1975 to 2002, and then the other one, the classical example, is the Korean Civil War, 1949 to 1953. I'm not going to go to details about each one because I've done it already for you in the PowerPoint and the material that I've provided. And then, of course, for more details, I want you to read the chapter. Here, the last major topic that I like to emphasize in terms of this particular topic is what happened at the end of the Cold War, where Berlin Wall fell, which means that it was a reunification politically of at least Germany. East and West Germany, they came together, politically became one country, which they used to be before, before World War II happened. Is that right? I mean, better to say before the Cold War started. I'm sorry, I didn't mean before World War II. During the World War II, obviously Germany was, one country, but at the end of it, one section of it, was separated from the other one, the section that the Soviet, troops were, occupying. So when the Berlin Wall fell, then the European integration started happening as well, not just politically, but also economically. Is that right? The European, they thought, you know what, we should really learn more to cooperate with one another, this and that, and function, and economy of scale, and provide these stuff. And this is some of the topics we're going to, focus a little bit more later on when we get into the whole notion of European Union and how it started, how it had a very, very basic, very modest start, and then it became even more sophisticated in that. So having said that one, this is really the major part of the chapter. So what I want to focus on is right now conclude by making sure that at least you, from all of these topics, you remember at least four major things. Remember, during the 1945 to 1989, there are four issues during this period that I want you to remember. One is about the UN and Security Council. That's one topic. Second topic, Cold War and the nuclear weapons. Third topic, decolonization and the superpowers proxy war in Global South. I know it's a long one, but you need to remember. And number 4, European integration and the fall of Berlin Wall. So I hope you remember all of these. Enjoy reading the chapter. This chapter, as you probably noticed, is much easier than the first couple of chapters, because the first couple of chapters are very theoretical, very conceptual, kind of sometimes difficult to digest. But this one is mostly like a history. History is like a story, and stories are usually what? Easier to remember. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have ever any questions, you always do what? You use our course inbox and you email me. Thank you.